pleasure to introduce our first speaker. I'm happy to introduce Colin Lavery, Chief Executive at NHS Lancashire and South Cumbria Integrated Care Board. As a leader of an NHS, Kevin will share his experience of the key challenges, the opportunities, and what we could do differently to break traditional approaches to enable healthier, integrated systems and to deliver better outcomes. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. In Lancashire and South Cumbria, we've got something like a £5 billion budget to deliver healthcare services, and about 60% of that is in the acute sector. And the key drivers of healthcare are the needs of our population. That population is growing, it's getting older with an increasing group of acute elderly with multiple long-term conditions, which are significant users of our services. We were badly hit by COVID, and we've got lots of complications coming through. And we've got quite a lot of poverty and cost of living issues in the area, which also drives healthcare needs. So we've got some big challenges with some poor health outcomes, some of the most challenging in the whole of the UK. But we also have lots of opportunities. If you look at our acute sector, for example, for a population of just under 2 million people, we've got 8 elective care centres, 6 A&E centres, 5 separate sets of support services using largely old technology and in some cases no technology. We spend more than 300 million on temporary staff at premium rates, and roughly 2/3 of our budget is spent on treating illness and only 1/3 on care in the community. Loads of opportunities to do things faster, better, smarter and cheaper. In order to do that, we need to see a major improvement in clinical productivity, and we need to reconfigure our system with a new clinical model, with back office transformation, and with much more happening in community settings. Our vision at Lancashire and South Cumbria, like many other systems, is fully aligned to what Darcy is asking us to do. Let's take the first area of Darcy's vision, moving care from hospitals to community settings. Our data tells us we've got 2 new hospitals in the new hospitals programme, and if we kept the delivery system as it is now, looking at population growth and the changing nature of that population and the changing prevalence of disease, we would require 60% more beds in our system. That's simply unaffordable by 2038. It's simply unaffordable. So this shift from an acute-centric to a community-centric system is not a nice to have, it's a must-do in order to live within our means going forward. And that's about making sure that people who don't need to be in hospital, who are close to end of life, or they've got conditions that could have been dealt with in the community, are dealt with in the community. It's about moving long-term condition management out of the acute sector into community settings. And it's about reducing admissions and demand for emergency departments by focusing on high-risk groups and keeping them well so that they can stay at home. A brilliant example of that is with one of our smaller hospitals in Barrow. We did some detailed analysis of the patients of that hospital and identified 835 patients who had 3 or more unplanned admissions to the hospital. That's a tiny proportion of the Furness population, but they accounted for 28% of unplanned admissions and 1/3 of bed days. And if we got on top of their medicines and provided therapy through our community services contract with the hospital, we felt we could reduce that very significantly. And within 8 weeks, we saw a 90% reduction from that group of 835 of second admissions. So it works, it can be done, but it's doing that on scale across our whole system. That is the big prize. The second Darcy area is the transition from analogue to digital. This is something that's been close to my heart since I joined the NHS in 2022. using the best technology available to really make a difference to healthcare. A brilliant example is virtual care. A lot of the focus is on virtual wards, but actually we need to be thinking much bigger than that. We need to be thinking about our whole prevention program, our whole care in the community program, and it has really practical applications way beyond the virtual wards program. We know, for example, that around a fifth of our hospital beds are filled with patients who are at end of life. Many planned deaths happen in hospitals, 50% in our system, and much of that could happen at home or in hospice environments, or with virtual technology, hospice at home packages similar to virtual wards, which are tailored to end of life patients. So there's a lot more we can do in that space. Also, the third element of Darcy's vision is around focusing on prevention over sickness. It's far better to treat people, far better to prevent ill health rather than treat it when it happens, is the basic theme. And we know that our healthcare needs are determined by the wider determinants of health: housing, jobs, education. These things are vital. So it's really important that as an integrated care board looking after the system, that we work well with all of those partners who are more involved in those wider determinants of health than we are in the NHS, like local government, like the voluntary sector, as two obvious examples. We've got lots of examples where we are pushing prevention over sickness. So one area would be our cancer team in terms of early diagnosis. We recently hit a milestone of 300 people in the system who had their cancers diagnosed earlier because of targeted lung health checks. That sort of stuff is gold dust, isn't it? But we've got lots of other examples across our system. We've had a big focus on at-risk people from high blood pressure. Spotting those symptoms earlier. These often lead to much more complications, to heart attacks later and strokes. So really, really important that we get on top of that. And we've done work. We saw a 12% shift in 1 year for the at-risk groups in that area. So that's an area where the ICB is really making a difference. And finally, I think overall, I would say we're in financial crisis as a system. We are one of the most financially challenged systems in England. So we are at a crossroads as a health service. After years of milk and honey, we are now looking at austerity for the immediate future. We have to live in our means, and that means we have to think differently if we're going to live within our means, because it's not just a case of getting a small efficiency here and a small we've got to do things very differently and approach it much more radically if we're really to bring these two things together. And it's also about delivering against those promises, isn't it? So I'll end with the fine words of the first American president, who said, "Well done is better than well said." Thank you.
Kevin, thank you for that. I mean, that's really ambitious program of transformation, some really, really good examples attached there. But you did leap us back into that financial crisis, which is across the NHS at present. And I know my ICBs are a similar size to yours, and I know the size of deficit we're still trying to bring down 3 weeks before we have to submit our final plan. So that's the scale of the challenge. I wanted to ask you in terms of, because you've come up with some really great initiatives, but they are not yet at full scale. I mean, those initiatives may be themselves, but that whole mindset, that whole shift actually needs to be replicated across all of the clinical service lines. And I wanted to get a sense from you about how you can create the headspace to develop those at scale across the ICB within a timescale that's going to deliver the financial savings that you need, and how you're going to identify the cash to invest in those, and the risk factor in terms of some of those transformations may not deliver the sort of financial gain that you're looking for. So Kevin, could you give me a bit
Yeah.
of a feel of how you're managing that in Lancashire and South Cumbria?
Look, I think you're right. There's a temptation when money is very tight to put off some of these things, but actually we treat it the other way. So we are in a crisis. That's also an opportunity, isn't it? As Winston Churchill famously said, "Don't waste the crisis." So what we're doing is sort of using it as a platform to face up to the things that actually it's quite hard to do in normal times. So let me give you a real practical example. Urgent and emergency care. We've done a lot of work in that space. That's in danger of overwhelming the whole hospital population and actually overwhelming all the good work that's been done on elective care too, if we're not careful. So in looking at corridor care, for example, it costs us £84 million a year. That's extra facilities, but mainly it's agency staff coming in at peaks rather than troughs to deal with, demand pressures at certain times of the year. So if we can do what I mentioned earlier on Barrow, of get on top of those patients who are acute elderly, get on top of their medicines, make sure there's good therapy provision locally, we can keep them at home and reduce some of those pressures significantly. If we can also do the same for end of life, where we've got half of our planned deaths and a fifth of our beds with end of life patients, again, it can have a major impact on the system and free it up. So I think this is all about looking at the crisis and then saying, actually, we're going to make a punt there. We're going to make an investment to do more, and actually that will reduce the deficit in our hospital sector. So it's about making it relevant, isn't it? And really focusing your efforts on a few projects. So having done it in Barrow, my target is Blackburn. That's the biggest blue light in the whole of the Northwest. And they too have got some significant challenges in their population, but actually that's the biggest opportunity in our system. So we want to replicate what we've done in Barrow in Blackburn.
Kevin, thank you. That's really clear and concise strategy. You've got some of the poorest communities in the country in your patch, and I wondered how you're going to wrap in that sort of third pillar of ICB's strategic duties around tackling health inequalities. Could you give me a bit of a flavour about how this approach actually does that as well?
Yeah, again, I think there's a bit of a double-edged sword here. It can go one of two ways, can't it? You can, in a crisis, you can cut back, and you can close facilities, and you can reduce access, and the people who get hit the hardest are those in those challenged neighbourhoods. On the other hand, you could look at the proposals for change carefully and see where can you actually press the buttons that actually do address some of the inequalities. So if I go back to my example in Barrow with the 835 acute elderly who were filling a third of the beds in the hospital, they were from 6 priority wards. So that's the sort of initiative that really makes a difference. And if we can replicate that in Blackburn and in Blackpool, two the most deprived towns in England, then I think we can, in a crisis, make a big positive difference to inequalities. Forever the optimist. Forever the optimist.
No, thank you for that, Kevin. I know we're going to lose you at 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
So I'm actually really keen. I'm going to use chair's privilege and ask another question. I don't know whether your pattern of provision is the same as ours in Southwest London, but if I look at our primary care general practice availability, my most affluent areas have almost twice as many GPs per head of population as my poorest, which means that my poorest communities' access to secondary care is inevitably through non-elective routes rather than through planned care, and the converse, of course, in the more affluent areas, which also impacts upon the clinical outcomes of those groups. Do you have that problem, and are you looking at what we might call allocative equity, particularly in relation to primary care?
I think it's a challenge for pretty much every area, Mike, but certainly primary care. Yes, we had 8 CCGs. They did things in 8 different ways. We had 8 different local contracts. So we're now working through having one contract for the whole patch, which does deal with the inequalities of funding, does have a consistent approach to which parts of long-term condition management, primary care handle, and which parts the acute sector do, and focuses very much on that prevention agenda around high risk groups, which means those practices who are working in those more deprived communities will have more to play with going forward. So that is something we're just working through now with a view to introducing it in May and April of this year. So it's right top of our agenda at the moment. It's a difficult area to go at, but I think it's also an exciting one.
Kevin, thank you for that. I might want to share notes with you offline on that one.
Good.
Because you're leaving us at 1 o'clock, your Director of Population Health, Andrew Bennett, will be joining us and taking over from you for the Q&A.
Yeah.
Andrew, before closing this section down, did you want to say anything in particular about the longer term aspirations around prevention and the use of population health data?
Well, yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, briefly, I think building on some of Kevin's messages, I think one of the mindset changes that we need across the whole service is about the use of data on population. You know, we're not dealing with an homogenous population. I think commissioning for too long hasn't been very sensitive. Neither has some of the provider behaviour either, in terms of how you work with different communities that have different needs. And I think we should start to expect this as a norm, that people that are in healthcare leadership roles are trained to use data. They don't have to go off to an information specialist to do it. They find ways of connecting it to their work. If they're a provider of community services or a GP commissioner, they're sensitive to the use of data and the segmentation of need across their population. So a kind of endorsement of the type of challenge that Kevin's been laying out, that applies to us, but applies to lots of other places as well.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. No doubt we'll hear much more from you when we have the Q&A at the end. I'm going